That is actually incorrect. I have stood up on this podium once before, and it was about the storing your treasures in heaven. If you remember that message I did give, I do. I guess it didn't make as much of an impact. Today, I will be discussing a subject that I will say, at the very least, I'm working on. So the subjects I will be discussing are both pride and humility. C.S. Lewis wrote, "A proud man is always looking down on things and people, and of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you." Throughout my successes and my struggles, I have had some insights, and I thought that I might be helpful in coming here to bring them up. I am by no means an expert, but I am coming and sharing in Thanksgiving to bring back what I have learned in the love for both what God has given to me, as well as in a loving spirit of the church. So, when learning, I have found it helpful to see opposites and to contrast them. So to look at pride and humility, it's best to look at them both and have a better understanding. But in that, pride has to be first. That is the very concept of pride by how it would allow itself to be defined. Pride seems like something that is a far-encompassing concept, at least in the modern interpretation. In some contexts, it can mean just being proud of something you achieved, but others it may be thinking that you're better than others. To make things clear, I want to look at the Hebrew translation so we're able to understand a biblical understanding of how it is being defined. So the Hebrew word for pride, gavah, is better translated as arrogance or haughtiness. This word is frequently used in the Old Testament to describe a proud or haughty person, signifies an inward attitude of self-exaltation that opposes God's will. The noun form also carries the meaning pride, arrogance, haughtiness, height, or even tall. To contrast, the root word humility comes from Latin humilis, meaning low or humble. This in turn is derived from the Latin word humus, meaning earth or ground. So when I saw these two, I was looking at it and thought the best examples that I had to contrast those two were the Tower of Babel and the formation of man. Man being created from the ground, and the Tower of Babel being the apex of civilization according to what humanity designated it. So in Genesis 2:7, then the Lord formed man from dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Being from the ground contrasts being from the ground contrasts to being tall, found in the translation of pride. Humility being that you're grounded and lowly, tall meaning you're constantly seen, always given attention, like the Tower of Babel, which was the height of man's achievement, and tried to be replicated by many current empires in that seeking that same attention. The attention, recognition, and respect received is certainly relevant in a measure of humility and pride that we'll discuss here today. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Who or what is the embodiment of pride in the biblical context? The best example we have is no one else but Lucifer and Satan himself. Pride was the cause of Satan's fall, as spoke of in Isaiah 14 and by Jesus in Luke 10. Lucifer desired to be like the Most High. This directly led to another fall, the fall of man and humanity. This same familiar desire to be like God was used to entice humanity into eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, as described in Genesis. Pride is considered by many to be the original sin in this context, then. Regarding pride, Proverbs 16:18-20 says, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Better to be lowly in spirit, along with the oppressed, than to share the plunder with the proud. Whoever gives heed to these instructions prospers, and is blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. Lucifer's pride, fueled by the desire to be like God, guided the path to destruction and led to the fall of man with Adam and Eve. The fall of man brought sin, and with sin, the consequence, death. This path had been the default route for humanity until God ordained a new perfected path. That perfected path was shown none other by God's only Son, Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. The path Jesus showed us is humility. Just as Jesus said in Matthew 20:16, so the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. A radically different concept showing the type of character he viewed as being worthy of God's blessing. Being first is not always as great as it appears. Humility is blessed by God and has been repeated throughout history as a foreshadowing of how God was to bless humanity. God has chosen those who are in lowly places to do great things. David was the youngest of sons and specifically chosen by God to be the king of Israel. Jacob was also the youngest of sons and chosen by God. The world chose the oldest, considering maybe that there was their skills or their whatever else they sought out as being that they had time to be the best. But here God chose the young and the humble. The world would have seen the lack of skills, but God saw the heart, blessed them, and equipped them for the challenges that they had ahead of them. Maybe one of the best examples of the blessing that Jesus was speaking of is found in the story told by Jesus of Lazarus. Lazarus lived a painful and difficult life. He would have been the last person that had food, the last person who got respect, the last person that had attention, the last person who was proud. When he died, he was first. God knew that he was a humble person and blessed him. He brought him to be in heaven with him and experience the full glory of God. Lazarus shows us very clearly how we can seemingly be last by the worldly standards, but first in what matters most, God's heavenly standards. The heavenly standards set by God were met by Jesus, and he is the one we are to look to in order to understand humility at how it is at its perfected form. Jesus set out a radically different path for humanity by humbling himself. He took on the sins of man, asking for forgiveness on our behalf, and offering his own life as a perfect sacrifice for all humanity. He was righteous in doing this because he was without sin and had authority over heaven and earth. Therefore, he did this act as a willing act of love. We can see that Jesus even prayed that he may be spared this test in Matthew 26. But Jesus followed through. He did this on his own will, voluntarily aligning with the will of God. Jesus was tasked to make the most challenging and consequential choice in existence: humility or pride. Jesus was wise and chose to trust God by humbling himself and following God. A modern-day act that I found very fitting that demonstrates the humility that Christ shows is something that we actually do here at this church, which is the washing of feet at communion. When Jesus did this, it was shocking to say the least. The disciples watched and were confused, and some were even revolted. This was an act of a servant. I can admit as well that I was uncomfortable when I first did this. My rationale that it was weird and kind of gross. Feet are stinky. Why would anyone want to do this? Jesus did this because he loved his disciples. He wanted to show a new kind of love that put aside comfort and voluntarily took action for a new kind of cleanliness that God was inviting us to join. We look at this selfless act and we should examine ourselves as Paul wrote in Romans. Romans 12:3, For the grace given to me, I say to you, every one of you, Do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourselves with sober judgment and according to the faith God has distributed to each of you. We are called in a radical new way where we are called to love in a radically new way where we serve others and do not think highly of ourselves. So what happens when we humble ourselves? We ultimately fear the same result that Jesus had, being crucified. A challenging and sobering reminder that the world saw his actions, hated him for it, to the point where they killed him. When we humble ourselves, our self-worth and pride is vulnerable to attack at the very least. We are seemingly now the subject of the whim of others. We are left vulnerable, at risk of pain, rejection, starvation, and death. This creates a vicious cycle that leads us to doubt God's power and love. Our lack of faith leads us to act selfishly because we believe in the scarcity of God's blessings that he has promised. It is not easy, and we will stumble. But even when we are not faithful, God is. The Lord is doing great miracles that began with Jesus and extend into our own lives because we believe in him. We grow like mustard seeds stronger each day, trusting in the Lord more and more. The will of God is what humility is all about. Those who humble themselves are secure. Their faith in God helps them overcome the fears that distract them because they are obeying the will of God and nothing has authority over them. Those who are insecure let fears dictate their actions. Humbling ourselves is the ultimate act of faith in God. Our selfishness, self-preserving nature is a constant battle we must constantly examine with wisdom on a daily basis. We cannot go through it alone, though. We need the help of each other. We need the help of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. The church is called to humbly support the people around the world who hunger and thirst for God's presence, and even those who would call us an enemy. To follow Jesus means to deny yourself and follow me. It is clear Jesus is calling us to a life of humble selflessness. In practice, how does this look, though? I think this is very, very much applied in the real world in relationships. Real relationships are built on authenticity and love. Selfishness only lasts so far when you're with any kind of relationship you're dealing with in life. Our church family is called to be a model of that selfless love in the world and applied so everyone can see it as an example of God's divine love for all humanity. We are to show each other and anyone who comes to join us the hospitality and love Jesus showed his disciples. We can work on our church relationships by perhaps helping set up for a picnic, helping with transportation, maybe a special tithe, other things, or even just talking with others after church. Just spending time in many ways is some of the most appreciated and blessed activities. All of these relationships are stronger when you build on the relationship that binds all of them together. The most important, our relationship with our Father in heaven. But how do we work on that relationship? For me, reading the Bible and prayer have been the two fundamental parts of really helping to develop that further. When praying to God, when we build that relationship, we get to know God, we learn the sound of his voice and who God is. Listening and most importantly, humbly following the will of God requires a leap of faith, but the very act of trying shows that you trust in God and the path, and this is the pathway that God works miracles through. So, to summarize everything for today, let us finish in remembering that pride is an illusion, just as all lies from Satan are. Pride is something that claims that it is finished and is complete and that is the best, yet constantly needs validation and confirmation to maintain that status. That is the paradox of pride, and therefore nothing more than a feeling that lasts a brief moment in time. The only thing that is complete is our redemption by the blood of our Savior, Jesus Christ.